Hi, and welcome to the Diablo podcast, your home for Diablo diehards, tryhards, casual, and hardcore alike. I am your host, Xanth, and today we are switching it up and doing something a little different. We brought in a New York Times best-selling author, Jason Schreier.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Xanth. It's gonna be fun to geek out about Diablo a little bit.
Yes, it will, and this is totally the first time we've had this conversation. Um, well, you're here because you literally wrote the book on Blizzard, which comes out October 8th. Before we go into that and all the great little details therein, who are you?
An existential question that I ask myself every night. I stare in the mirror and ask myself that same thing and just never get a satisfying answer. Yeah, I'm a reporter. I write about the video game industry mostly, and I've been doing that for quite a long time, 15 years or so. And Play Nice, which comes out October 8th, as you mentioned, is my third book. My previous books are Blood, Sweat, and Pixels and Press Reset, and I write for Bloomberg.com, is where most of my writing shows up these days.
I feel like the sports analogy to who you are is like I kind of equate you to Adam Schefter. And like if I see you reporting on it, I know it's legit and I know I can trust that information. So if you're not following Jason, you absolutely should be. You neglected you also have a podcast.
Yeah, the Triple Click podcast. We do our thing every week. That's also a lot of fun. Me and two of my former colleagues from Kotaku started this podcast a few years ago, and yeah, check it out at Triple Click.
Yeah, it's a real treat. It's in my weekly rotation, and
Awesome.
it's
Thank you.
enjoyable. Yeah, happy to help. Jason, I'm happy to help in that regard.
Keep,
Uh,
yeah, keep fighting the good fight.
so you've got a podcast. You write books. You do video game journalism, and I want to point out that like you do real video game journalism. It's not necessarily just punditry, but like real investigative reporting. So first and foremost, thank you for that. I think it is nice to see something that goes into that level of depth and shines a light on things that maybe get pushed aside.
Kind of you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right, so enough building you up. Let's tear you down. What is your Diablo
Please.
experience? Like as you're coming in, you're writing the book on Blizzard. We'll talk big picture, but Diablo as a franchise, what's your experience? Coming up, we're of similar age, so
So here is where, like, I bet a lot of people out there are like, "Oh, who is this? Who is this jerk who wrote this book about Blizzard? Bet he doesn't even know anything about Blizzard." Well, my friend, the number of hundreds of hours that I spent on Diablo 2 will prove you wrong. So Diablo 1 came out, what was it, 96? So I would have been like 9 or 10 when I first played Diablo 1, which I think was a little too young to really appreciate it. I found it really difficult, could never really get into it, but I do have some memories of like getting up to the butcher and just being like, okay, like what is going on in this game? It's so cool, but I cannot get past this guy. So never really made much progress in Diablo 1 growing up. But Diablo 2, that came out when I was 13, so perfect age. I just would spend like so many hours, like summer hours especially. I believe it came out in the summer, and I remember just spending an entire summer. And then Lord of Destruction came out the following year. So many hours, like up in the attic at my parents' house, just like on that computer, on that old chunky desktop, leveling up my paladin, hunting for Stones of Jordan. So my going on Mephisto runs, of course. My Diablo 2 addiction was very real. That was my game for a very long time. Diablo 3 and 4, I played a bunch of both games, but like never hooked me the way Diablo 2 did. I think mostly because that was the age when you get hooked on like a game like that is when you're 13. Although I'm sure there's also parts of the gameplay and the design that made Diablo 2 especially addictive. There were no other games like it. That was another big factor as well. But yeah, big Diablo 2 guy.
so you alluded to a paladin. I mean, favorite class, favorite build, if it comes to mind.
Yeah, I played Necromancer for a bit, but Paladin, I was the kind of guy who was like, I want to try all the classes, but Paladin was the one that I got the furthest over the years. I believe, I don't remember exactly what the build was. I think it was like a lot of focus on auras, and I don't think it was like an optimal build because I wasn't like at 13, 14, I wasn't like looking online for like the best possible way to min-max your character. So I don't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, I was very into Paladin. I had a sorceress that got fairly far. I had a frost sorceress that I liked. But Paladin was the one that I got the furthest, like started really cracking like hell difficulty on.
Um, okay. So there's a little bit of this logical connection as Blizzard had sunk its hooks into you at that early age and kind of enraptured you with what it was doing. Um, but was there any other reason that would draw you to writing a book about Blizzard specifically? Like what is it about this studio that would focus your attention in on it?
Yeah, I mean, so it helped that I was a fan of Blizzard games, but that isn't the reason that I wanted to write this. I don't think that's like a good, compelling reason. It's not enough to spend. I spent 3 years of my life on this project, and like Lord knows how many phone calls and interviews and hours put into it. It's not something you can only do based on fandom. The reason that I chose to do this book is because I thought it was a fascinating story, and really the seeds of it were kind of planted in like 2018, I would say. That's not when I started working on the book. I started working on the book in 2021, but the seeds of it were planted when I like first started hearing about and then reporting on the Activision takeover of Blizzard. And Blizzard's parent company at the time, Activision Blizzard, was just like taking a much heavier hand in operations at Blizzard to the point where it drove out CEO and co-founder Mike Morhaime, who quit the company in October of 2018. And so that was kind of like, okay, there's an interesting story here. And then in the months and years that followed, there were so many kind of dramatic twists and controversies from Diablo Immortal to Blitzchung to Warcraft 3 Reforged and so much more. And I got to the point where I was like, this is really interesting. Like maybe there's a book to be written about the Activision takeover of Blizzard. And then I started working on it in about March of 2021. And then just a few months later, the California government sued Blizzard for sexual misconduct and discrimination. And I was like, wow, this is becoming a real saga now. Like now, even more twists and turns added to the story. And then, yeah, I was like full steam ahead at that point, and just crazier and crazier things kept happening, and the story became even more wild, and I felt even more justified in the decision to tell this particular story and hopefully do it justice.
Well, I absolutely think you did. You know, I think we'll over the course of this podcast hype up the book a lot. Um, I want to point out. So I'm an English teacher by trade. I hate nonfiction. It's just not my jam. I if I'm going to read for fun, it's never nonfiction. I've read your
Uh-huh.
book 2 times already, because it is so well written and well constructed that even I was able to get past those barriers.
You're
Um,
too kind. Thank you. Even though English teachers forced me to read books that I just had no interest in growing up, but
that
I do
actually is our
appreciate.
specialty.
That is right.
That's how
It's
we
like
get our
I loved
strength.
reading. Man, when I grew up, I love when I was like in high school, middle school, I loved reading and I would read all the time. But whenever an English teacher assigned me a book, I just couldn't read it. I was like so anti-authority, anti whatever. I was just like, no, I can't do this. Instead, I'm gonna go read like Animorphs or whatever, because I can't read friggin' Pride and Prejudice or whatever they were making
Oh,
me read at the
I will agree with you on Pride and Prejudice. It's awful. Now we're going to get
time.
nothing. It's going to be nothing but comments about how Pride and Prejudice is the most amazing novel. It's not. Um,
Shakespeare too, making us read Shakespeare plays is just that's
all right,
brutal.
well, I mean, Hamlet's pretty good. Uh,
I mean, no, the stories are good, but like having to parse the text just
yeah.
feels to me like it's if there were modern versions, I'd be like, okay, this is cool.
Well, I guess Sons of Anarchy, that's modern, or
Sure.
Lion King. All right, we're getting on tangents. We want to
Much
talk
ado
about
about nothing. Like in what was it? 10 Things I Hate About You. I could watch
that's
that. Sure.
Taming of the Shrew.
Oh, that's Saving the Shit. Right.
But again, did we expect to go to Shakespeare? No. Um, But I guess maybe there is some Shakespearean elements to the story of Blizzard. Um,
Hubris for sure.
um, So as you're coming through and writing this, is this a story that you think is unique to Blizzard, or do you think this is a story that resonates out into multiple studios across the world?
I think there are elements of this particular story that are unique to Blizzard, and then elements that resonate. And the like one of the reasons that I found this book super compelling and wanted to do it is because so much of it like tells a story that can resonate with people, whether even if you don't know what Blizzard is, like even if you don't care about Blizzard games, I think you can read this book and get a lot out of it because the kind of the fundamental, the Activision versus Blizzard part of the story, and that's not the only part of the story. It's a pretty big kind of sweeping narrative, but that part of the story resonates to anyone who's had that kind of question or been kind of confronted with the dilemma of the conflict of business interests versus creative interests, and like the spectrum of like creative people who want to take all the time they want on a project, and business people who want their financial targets hit in a given fiscal quarter, and that's the most important thing to them. And that to me is really interesting, and I think kind of that saga. This is kind of a heightened example of that can really be reflected in a lot of ways. But then, of course, a lot of the details are unique to Blizzard. A lot of the kind of the greatness of Blizzard is pretty unique. I don't think there might be one other company in the world, or at least in the video game world, that has created as many hit billion-dollar franchises as Blizzard has. It's like Blizzard and Nintendo. Those are the two. Those are the only ones. There are a lot of gaming companies that have come out with hits, maybe even a few hits. But the number of companies who have created these just lasting franchises that not only have made billions of dollars, but also just like created so many fond memories for people and just like been so special to people in the way that Warcraft, Diablo, Hearthstone, StarCraft, and Overwatch all did. Like there are very few companies out there quite like that. So I think that in that sense, Blizzard is unique, and obviously there are a lot of other little details that are very unique to Blizzard, from like the good to the weird. Weird as an example, just the amount of incestuous relationships that happen on campus and how everybody was dating each other, including bosses and subordinates. So yeah, good to weird, good, weird, and bad. Like it's all there are a lot of unique aspects to the Blizzard story, I would say.
Yeah, it is. It is a very unique company, a very unique culture. Um, we've learned more about it, and the veil has been pierced in the past, 15 years, um, where the old school days of Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 are kind of viewed as these halcyon days of perfection. But over the course of the book, I think you highlight that that's not necessarily the case. Do you think if we had, the kind of coverage that we do now, that Blizzard's issues would have came to light a lot sooner?
Which issues specifically are you talking about?
If we're talking about, like general, like misogynistic relationships or like just general sexual harassment and assault or any of those kind of issues, um, it seems like that was built in originally to the start of the company. Um, maybe not as prominent as what we did get to see, but was still there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 were being developed at, of course, Blizzard North, which was a few hundred in San Francisco Bay Area, a few hundred miles north of Blizzard that we know of in Irvine, the main Blizzard that we know of today. Uh, I think that at Blizzard North there were like no women working there, maybe one or two at most. So a very different type of environment than what would happen a little bit later, mostly at the Blizzard in Irvine, which is that more women started to work there, but some of them ran into real issues and like had to deal with harassment and discrimination. So my understanding is that like at Blizzard North, it was because it was 95% men. It wasn't quite like on the level of what would happen a little bit later after World of Warcraft, when like a lot of dudes were getting really rich and really famous, and like women were joining the company more, and then there were some real problems. The problem I heard more about, well, two problems I heard more about from people at Blizzard North. One is crunch, and that I think was really, really bad, excessive overtime, especially on Diablo 2, where it really just kind of ruined some people's lives and marriages in some case. David Brevik, who was the president of the studio and the director of Diablo and Diablo 2, told me that it ruined his marriage, ruined his relationship with his daughters, really sad stuff. And the other one is kind of a toxic environment in general, just people not getting along super well, especially in the days after Diablo 2 came out when factions started to form at the company. People were at each other's throats for all sorts of reasons, and that created a pretty toxic workplace, I would say. To answer your question, I mean, I do think that I don't think that the press in general was covering the video game industry. I don't think there was that kind of like scrutiny held to the video game industry back then. Um, I don't know if things would have felt different if people were talking it more. It doesn't feel like it was the same type of atmosphere as far as scrutiny and press coverage, and like even when there was press coverage, it doesn't feel like people talked about it quite as much. But I don't know. It's hard to say. It's hard to say what certainly would have felt different if the company wasn't quite as opaque. Like it very much enjoyed its kind of like veil of secrecy and this idea of like we're gonna go and squirrel off when it's ready. It'll be ready when it's ready. That said, there was plenty of Blizzard in the press back then. There was still I talk in the book about during the development of StarCraft One, this group of fans who call themselves Operation CWAL, can't wait any longer, who would like scope out Blizzard's parking lot to see if people were there at the office working and like write about it online. So it was definitely an atmosphere where like fans were there of like hyper fandom. Um, so I don't know. I mean, long-winded way of saying I don't really know if there was more scrutiny. Would it have changed things? Would it have changed our overall view on Blizzard? I don't know. But I do think some of the issues that have been brought up later about kind of the climate of sexual discrimination and harassment, that stuff happened a little bit later than like the Diablo 1, Diablo 2 days for the most part. I do have a couple of stories in the book about incidents that happened earlier. There was one notable incident with a QA person, a woman who started in QA in 2000 or so, and was just harassed pretty viciously, asked by her manager really inappropriate questions, and like men would just line up to meet her, to greet her. It was super gross the way she was treated. So it did happen, but it wasn't quite the same climate in large part because there weren't as many women working there.
Which makes sense when as you're kind of going in covering the rise of Blizzard and how they were uh, prohibitive in who they hired, or very particular about who they hired. The barrier for entry was a little bit higher. Um, I do think you have this great balance over the course of the book as we're sitting here and we're dwelling on a lot of these horrible things, that you're also still able to kind of balance it with some passion. I point out because you got Greg Miller read this book and then the next day was installing World of Warcraft on a PC to go and play it. So it's not all doom and gloom. Uh, how did you find that balance? Like, how did you manage to strike that tone?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was super hard because, like, a lot of, pretty much the entirety of the book, most of the book is based on conversations that I've had with people who were there. Because as a reporter, I generally like to work with firsthand sources, with primary sources, with people who were in the room at the time. And hearing people's stories, both men and women, a lot of people are happy to talk about, like, all the things they loved about working at Blizzard. And there are a lot of parts in the book where I talk to women who are like, yeah, well, this thing was awesome. And like, yeah, I might have faced some like shittiness here and there, or like, this is what the kind of the worst parts of the job are like, but that they don't take away from the best parts. There's a woman, for example, who I quote and I talked to named Nikki Broderick, and she talked to me a little bit about how like uh, some awful stuff she went through, pay discrimination. Like someone told her that like her ass looked great in the shorts she was wearing, and she was like, "God, I'm never wearing shorts to the office again." It was really miserable the way she was treated. But at the same time, she's like, "My best friends in the world I met at Blizzard. My entire bridal party was people who I met at Blizzard. Like I will never forget the memories I have of like meeting those people and spending time with those people, even though I also like had some like poor treatment at work, it still was a special place to me. And I think that I tried to capture some of that in the book and those kind of conflicting feelings because I think it's important to kind of look at the nuance of that and to recognize that you can still love a place and love the good times even if you are also kind of sour because of some problems that you face there as well. And then, of course, the point of the book was not to be a book about like the scandals and problems at Blizzard. Like, I don't think I think it's doing a disservice to everybody, men and women alike, to only think of Blizzard as a place that had to deal with a sexual harassment crisis because like there's so many first and foremost there's so many gaming companies that had to do that, like every, and not to mention all the tech companies, like every company that is dominated mostly by men has had to deal with crises like that because they haven't, because I mean that's just what has happened in our history. Like when a company is 70+% men, it is probably going to be harder for women to work there, and that's super unfair to those women, but that's what has traditionally happened, and Blizzard isn't exactly an exception on that front. But also, like, I think in a 33-year history of the company, I think you really have to explore so much more than that. And that wasn't when I set out to write the book, it was to chronicle the entire story of Blizzard, and I think the misconduct and the issues that they faced are part of that story, but not the only story.
Yeah, I think it is. There's that fine line that you do walk in terms of like covering everything and the complexity of any fandom, right? Where you have those bits and pieces, and you obviously like the tagline is the rise, the fall, and the future of um, where you are looking ahead to see what is in store and hope. I think like with everything that it gets better and that they learn from whatever mistakes that they made along the way. Um, so let's go back to Diablo 1 and Diablo 2. Then we got a whole host of other things as we talk about the rise and fall. But the rise of Diablo, right? Diablo 1, Diablo 2. So what are some of the stories that you heard along the way about the beginning of our franchise?
Yeah, Diablo was a really fascinating one. So it started, of course, in David Brevik, in his head, essentially, named after the mountain he lived near when he was growing up in California. And yeah, the saga of that first game is really interesting. Blizzard North, which at first was called Condor, were working on the project, pitching it around. Eventually ran into the Blizzard folks at a trade show. They both happened to be working on different versions of the Justice League fighting game at the time, and the people of Blizzard North had no idea that there was like another version being developed down south in Irvine, and so it was quite a shock to them. But then they started getting along with the Blizzard South people, and it led to a pretty strong partnership. And then Diablo One became this real joint effort where it was mostly designed to develop by the people in Blizzard North, but then the Irvine people really dropped everything during the final few months to help out, to do testing and bug fixes, and like form a strike team that would come and like give feedback on the game. And Chris Metzen down south wrote the story for the game, this kind of rudimentary story, if you remember from the first game. Blizzard South made the cinematics for the game. Including the end cinematic where the main character like just shoves the soul stone in his head. That was people at Blizzard South, like and Blizzard North people were like, "What is this? Like, what's going on?" Like they had no idea. By the way, fun fact. Oh man, I have a great story that you and your listeners will appreciate, which is that when I was a kid growing up playing Diablo, I would always skip the cinematics. I just had no interest in watching the cinematics. Like, sadly, this is not something I told people while I was interviewing them who worked on the cinematics, but maybe a couple. But anyway, so I would always skip the cinematics. And then many, many years later, I don't even remember how this came up. It might have been while I was working on this book or reading something. I don't know. I saw people talking about someone called Marius, and I was like, what the hell is Marius? Like, I've played so many hours of Diablo 2, I have no idea what that name even is. And of course, Marius is the character who's like only in the cinematics of the game, and I never once watched the cinematics of the game because I didn't have patience for them as a teenager. So I had no idea that there was this whole ass character. And then I realized, oh, that's really interesting because it kind of reflects how like the cinematics people at Blizzard South were in their own world doing their own thing that had nothing to do with what the actual game being made up north was. Which is kind of an interesting thing, and it reflects some of the tensions and divisions that the two companies would have over time. But yeah, it turns out that you can play all of Diablo 2 and have no idea who Marius is.
So that's much akin to Greg Miller. When we were chatting about Diablo, he skipped every single thing that he possibly could. Um, so
I
I
don't
don't
do that
know.
anymore. For the new ones, I watch the Lilith cutscenes for what it's worth.
Okay, okay. So you've redeemed yourself a little bit in that. Uh, no, I totally get it from that young age. I mean, I was
Yeah, well,
absorbed
Greg has
with the
the
lore.
mind of a 14-year-old, so it makes sense.
That's yeah, yeah, that's fair. Um, but yeah, I get it. Like, when you are buying Diablo 2 at that time, like, what do you want to do? You want to kill monsters. You want to get after it. At next act, next act. I've shown it to my son, who's 13, and yeah, he's not that interested. He just wants to fight something.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I just wanted
It's
to
like,
get to the next loot drop.
yeah, absolutely. That's way more addicting. That's not going to happen during a cutscene. Um, okay, so Brevik, obviously, phenomenal, uh, amazing vision. The story of Blizzard North coming apart. I didn't know that they were bluffing, or at least thought they were. Can you share that story?
Yeah, so the story here is so Blizzard North, the whole all of Blizzard was owned by a company named Vivendi after a whole lot of corporate shuffling that led them to that. And Vivendi, as a parent, was not super communicative, especially to the North folks, because like technically Blizzard North reported into Blizzard South, although they saw themselves as like on equal footing with like Mike Morhaime and Alan Adham, the people down south. Long story short, the Blizzard North people one day started seeing articles in the press that were like, "Hey, Blizzard, or Vivendi Games, including Blizzard, might be sold to 2K, might be sold to Microsoft." And they were like, "What the hell? Why are we finding out about this in the press? What are we supposed to tell our staff when we have no idea what's going on?" And so they started getting together and just complaining, and then eventually they drafted up a letter and it essentially said, "Hey, Vivendi, if you don't give us this, and this," and it was essentially like protections in their contracts, in case of a sale, a demand for more communication, more transparency, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't do this, we will resign. And this was a tactic they had used in the past, and it had been effective. It had gotten them some of the stuff that they asked for, more money for their team, bonuses, that sort of stuff. So they figured it might be effective now too. But as soon as they sent that, they all left for the weekend and then scrambled to get back together on Saturday, only to find out. I think they met at the Schaefer's house to find out that Vivendi had in fact accepted their resignations. Um, they were bluffing, Vivendi accepted, and then on Monday they were all gone. Now, the other piece of context that's important here is that at this point, Blizzard North was in shambles, like toxic work environment. Their projects were not going anywhere. They'd spent 2 years essentially like floundering as they tried to make something happen and just did not. It was kind of a mess up there, which I'm sure played into the ultimate decision. And so what happened next is Mike Morhaime, who was the president of Blizzard at the time, flew up with his executive staff. They all kind of they did some house cleaning in their perspective. They canceled one of the projects Blizzard North was working on, switched everybody to Diablo 3, laid off some staff, put in a new studio head. At one point, they actually asked Brevik to stay while letting the Schaefers and Bill Roper leave, but who were the other kind of bosses at the time. But Breivik did not want to do that. He didn't want to leave his friends. And then they all moved on without the bosses, and suddenly Blizzard North was a very different place.
And eventually, no more.
Yeah,
Um,
2 years it lasted working on Diablo 3 before World of Warcraft came out and then kind of vacuumed everybody's attention at the company and changed all of their priorities and really led to a rethink in how Blizzard South was like, whether they wanted an office up in the Bay Area anyway. They decided, well, we still want to do Diablo 3, but you know what, we're just going to bring it in-house. And so they said, some of you, I think most people, but definitely some, have the option of moving if you want. If you want to keep working at Blizzard, you can come move to Irvine, 400 miles south, or otherwise, this is goodbye, and shut down the place in the summer of 2005.
Now, before we depart, Blizzard North, you said you had a story about patch 1.10 that
Uh-huh,
didn't make the
uh-huh.
book. So this is Diablo podcast exclusive right here.
Yeah, this is okay. So, this in method. Okay, so context here. I already told you I was a big fan of Diablo 2, and so back when I was playing Diablo 2, there was all this talk on the internet about the kind of legendary patch 1.10. Do you remember this? This is like Blizzard says this patch is coming. It's going to be transformative. It's going to fix dupes and cheating. It's going to like fix all these bugs. It's going to sorry, it's going to rework the entire game. Um, and then a year went by and it wasn't out, and another year went by and it wasn't out. It took like 2 friggin' years. And at the time, maybe because like some of us were teenagers, at the time that felt like forever. Nowadays, it's like Silk Song takes 5 years and we're all just like, yeah, this is normal. But back then, it took 2 years and everyone was going crazy because it just seemed so stunning. And this was also a time when like a new Blizzard game would come out every 2 years. So it wasn't so like to wait 2 years for a whole patch seemed insane. When it did come out, it changed everything. It added like synergies. It added Uber Diablo as a way to fix the cheating problem and the duping problem that Diablo 2 had. Instead of like actually zapping it and killing the websites that were like supporting it and killing the tools, they created the world boss to which you had to feed Stones of Jordan to summon, and so everybody who had duped all those Stones of Jordan would now just sacrifice them to get this world boss out, which is kind of a brilliant move. Anyway, while I was researching and reporting for this book, I found out that the reason patch 1.10 took so long is because it was entirely developed by one man, Peter Hu. One man was responsible for this entire project, and he spent 2 years tweaking and working and coming up with synergies, coming up with the world boss, everything entirely him. He might have had like an artist to like work on UI and something like that, but it was entirely him programming this thing. Um, Here's a really crazy thing, the real crazy part of this. So Peter Yu was so when that implosion at Blizzard North happened and the founders all left, they decided, okay, we're going to take like a faction of our own people and we're going to go start this new thing, Flagship Studios. They then went on to make Hellgate London and then Torchlight and so on and so forth. Although Torchlight, they started a different studio, but still, they went on to do other stuff. Peter Yu was supposed to go with them. But when the implosion happened, he still hadn't finished patch 1.10. So he was like, look, he said to those guys, he said to Morheim, he said to everybody, this is a little awkward. I want to stick around just to finish this thing, and then I'm going to go with them, but you got to let me stay here just so I can finish this thing. And that's what happened. He stuck around until not until it was like out the door, but until his work on it was done so it could go out the door, and then it went out the door and he was out of there. So patch 1.10, dramatic story there.
That's a true labor of love. I feel like there's a sitcom somewhere in there in which you're just like, all right, my job, I'm gonna milk this for as long as I can. I'm still getting a check.
Yep, yep.
Yeah, I, I want that job. That sounds awesome too. Like you just basically own Diablo 2 for 2 years. You're making it better eventually. Yeah, that doesn't sound awful.
Yep.
Um, what does sound awful is a 10-year wait between Diablo 2 and Diablo 3. Now, granted, there was a lot of stuff happening. It does sound like you got to hang out with friend of the show, Jay Wilson, and do a little bit of chatting. Um, Because it's when Jay comes in that Diablo 3 starts to coalesce into what we ended up getting. Um, what was your sense with Jay in talking? And correct me if I'm wrong if you didn't talk to him, but I believe you.
Yeah, there's a chapter, the Diablo 3 chapter, the first of two Diablo 3 chapters, is focused pretty centrally on Jay and his kind of journey. Yeah, so Diablo 3, it started really in 2001 after Diablo 2, and there was a version created at Blizzard North that was worked on in fits and starts and went through various reboots that was a little more MMO-ish. David Brevik wanted to make something that was a little more massive, more I don't know if it would have felt exactly like Diablo 4 feels today, but certainly more in that nature where like you see other people in towns and that sort of thing. More like what WoW would become. That kind of fell apart in favor of like a more traditional like Diablo 2.5, which was after Brevik left, like later at Blizzard North. And then that also just kind of like was no more when Blizzard North was shut down and everybody moved down south, or some of the people moved down south. And yeah, then they brought in. Well, it was there was like a little bit of a pause, other than like some engine work or something like that, because World of Warcraft needed people, so everybody got kind of sucked into World of Warcraft for a little while. Um,
As I think
like
most of the world did at that time.
yeah, it's true. It's true. It vacuumed the attention of everybody at the company, like I mentioned. So everybody, all hands on deck for that thing. So that put it on pause. And then Rob Pardo, who was the vice president of design at the time, he brought in Jay Wilson, who he liked because a bunch of them had liked the games that Jay worked on at Relic in Canada, the Dawn of War games. And so they thought he was a talented designer. They were like, "Hey, come work on Diablo 3. Come be the lead designer on Diablo 3." And so he came down and started putting that team together, and kind of he was saddled with some of the people from Blizzard North, and then also newer people. It was kind of a motley crew of folks. And they had to figure out how to make this game that like would live up to Diablo 2 somehow. This game that at this point had really become legendary in a lot of people's minds, Diablo 2. It was on top of all the greatest games lists, and it was just kind of it occupied an important piece of a lot of people's heads. A lot of people, yeah, people just thought it was one of the greatest games ever. And so, yeah, they spent the next few years working on Diablo 3. There were a lot of arguments, both internally and externally, about the art style and a lot of other stuff. And it just took a while for various reasons. It just took a long time. Progress moved slowly for all sorts of reasons. They spent a lot of time iterating on stuff. I didn't get into the super in depth in the book, but they went through like 30 different iterations of the skill system before they landed on the one that they went with. Um, which is interesting. The one that they went with, I think that might be, other than the art style, maybe the most controversial aspect of Diablo 3 is like the runes and the way that that skill system works. Because in Diablo 2, part of the fun of the skill system is that you're making permanent decisions, and so you have to really think about what you're doing. Whereas in Diablo 3, it was the opposite, and you could just be experimenting with everything all the time, which I think takes away some of the weight of those skill choices, and you don't really need to worry about builds quite as much. You do need a build if you're gonna like play optimally, but you can change it at any time as opposed to planning it out in advance, which really I think changes the nature of the game. And then yeah, came out with that thing in 2012 to some controversy.
Just just a little bit. Just a little bit. I do think you you paint a sympathetic light for Jay, and I think that it's so deserving. I would argue out of all the people in the book, like you alluded to Brevik, he um, crunches himself out of his marriage and out of his daughter's lives, and that was a self-inflicted wound. It's not that he did it to himself, but he he was choosing the path that he was on. Jay Wilson, kindest man. Uh, his wounds weren't self-inflicted, and were there choices along the way? Sure, but the level of vitriol that he received by just existing, I think rivals just about anybody else within Blizzard's history. where you just feel bad for the guy.
Yeah, so Jay opened up to me quite a bit for the book, and was I think pretty brave in sharing some of his stories and some of the mental health struggles and drug struggles that he went through. A lot triggered by the ire of the internet, which I think was not just because of Diablo 3, although a lot of it was, and the controversies associated with that, but also the Facebook comment he made that I document in the book that was kind of like basically David Brevik kind of criticized Diablo 3 or said it wasn't quite the game he would have made, it wasn't the choices he would have made, and there was some anger about that from the Blizzard employees who had worked on Diablo 3, including Jay Wilson, who wrote an explicit comment criticizing Brevik, and that led to
And like
some
I
a
think like
lot of outrage.
the shitty thing about that is that it was a comment said in like, and I know it's the internet, especially at the time, but it was never meant like as a press release, right? This was a guy who was just trying to defend his team
Yeah.
in what he thought was a safe spot,
What I thought was a private Facebook page. Yeah, 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 yeah.
and it just and I feel ironically the interview that he was referring to was with our original site. So our editor, Rush, was the one interviewing David, which sparks this whole thing. Um, unfortunate, unfortunate, but it kind of wrecked him. Um, and I hope to not see anything like that again because it just at the end of the day, I think you do a very good job of portraying even Bobby Kotick as real people. That I think sometimes it's easy to paint people into a corner and say that this is your role, this is who you are, and this is how I'm allowed to feel about you, while neglecting that they are real people at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's important to me as a journalist is like I don't really believe in heroes and villains and cartoon characters as people. I think a lot of people do bad things, a lot of people do good things, and they're clear kind of like people who you might want to spend time with or work with and people who you might not. But like I don't think that anyone is a cartoon villain, and it's really important to me as a journalist and as a writer to try to get everybody's perspective in there, and to try to have the reader understand, if not necessarily agree with the decisions that a given person makes. Less important, I would say, when talking about someone sexually harassing people. Like, I don't really need to get inside that person's head and understand why they were sexually harassing people. But for the business elements, for the cultural elements, for like the parts of the story where you might see someone and think, someone like Bobby. I mean, I think a lot of people will come away from this book thinking, oh man, like Bobby Kotick ruined Blizzard for this, and this reason. But to me, it was very important to try to show, at least give more insight into why he made the decisions he did, which hopefully the book is able to do.
I don't think I walked away like, thinking Bobby Kotick was a champion for all video game culture and all of those things. But I think you were able to present him in a manner that was, and I think when we were emailing, three-dimensional, which is something I had just never seen with him before. And I can still vehemently disagree with many things, but it was nice to get some of his history to understand where he came from. And then I think like in some ways there are lots of things that make sense in terms of decisions he would make because he was running a business. It's not it's a product. So there was some logic behind it and was insightful in that regard.
I mean, you have two companies that wind up being like oil and water because one company is run by people who believe that games are just kind of these maybe art. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. More like games are like unique forms of entertainment that should be super fun and that you should enjoy, and like being great and fun, that's what's most important. Being like good for players. To Mike Morhaime most of its existence, the idea was like we want to make games that are player first and like that just value the player. Whereas Activision's approach under Bobby Kotick was always like, no, this is a product and we want to sell it. And in order to make as much as possible and watch our numbers grow up every year. And like Bobby never claimed to be a gamer or a video game fan or someone who was doing this for the art or fun of it. Like he was a businessman who wanted to do this for money, and it didn't matter to him whether he was selling games or like I don't know grocery items. Like that was not as important. He just saw this as a lucrative opportunity, and understanding that helps like make clear why things turned out the way that they did. Even if you come away from that being like, God, I don't want Bobby Kotick in charge of a video game company again. You can see what why he chose to like I don't know run Guitar Hero into the ground or whatever. Like that's just how he viewed things.
Yeah. Uh, and like I said, it's an introspective view of this man that I thought I knew, but I definitely do not. Um, and yeah, I don't feel sympathy. I mean, the man has billions of dollars. He'll be okay. Um, he doesn't need my appreciation, but
No, no.
yeah, it was an interesting perspective to kind of get at. Jay Wilson aside, as we kind of look at Diablo 3, it has a little bit of a tumultuous run. It starts poorly with Era 37, and then the end game needing some work, and then Jay's departure. Uh, but it makes up. We get to Reaper of Souls shortly thereafter. Things are moving in the right direction, but there is no sequel. There is no second expansion. I didn't know this. In the book, we don't want to give everything away, but there was a planned second expansion.
Mhm, mhm. Um, yeah, it wasn't. I wouldn't even say it was planned. Like it was so early. There was a story floating around at some point that was like, here are the details of the canceled second expansion for Diablo 3, and those actually weren't true. It wasn't. It didn't get far enough to like have details or plans. But yes, that was the plan. The plan was like we are going to come out with Reaper, and it's gonna change the world and change the way people think of Diablo 3, and then we're gonna come out with another one. But that did not happen for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, because people within Blizzard's executive circle, a few months before Reaper launched, A, didn't think it was gonna like save the brand. B, didn't like thought the Diablo 3 name was tarnished and like thought it was unsalvageable and figured that like the best move was actually to go and just do a quick new Diablo 4 a couple years later and try to redeem the franchise that way. So they canceled the second expansion before Reaper of Souls even came out, and like there was before there was even an opportunity to see how it did. And of course, Reaper of Souls did phenomenally and was critically acclaimed and commercially successful. So uh, giving it some more time might have been the wise move in that case. But then the other problem, the other kind of wrinkle here is that Diablo never had any sort of recurring revenue model. The auction house was gone, and that was one potential way to do that. And now there was nothing. You just buy the game once, and that's it. And for an online game that requires servers to be operated kind of indefinitely, that is a bit of a problem because if you have millions of people all on these servers, you might wind up losing money in the long run. And if they're not spending anything, but you have to pay to keep them playing, so that could be a problem as well.
Which kind of coincides with what we just heard, I think about a week ago about Diablo, that they've essentially brought in about $1 billion and it's in since release with about 150 million equated to microtransactions.
Yeah, I don't was this was like something that just came out, you're saying about Diablo 4?
Yeah, like about a week ago, essentially.
Gotcha.
That someone's LinkedIn profile from Blizzard alluded to the sales records. Um,
Got it.
what? Makes sense why you would maybe want a model like that because they're bringing in some money, keeping the lights on,
Yep.
and keeping the game going instead of having to
Yeah.
drop off a little early.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, just as a player, it's funny. I know there are a lot of people who are just kind of like so anti microtransaction, especially in games that you have to pay for, 60, $70 games. But to me, having microtransactions that are cosmetic do not matter to me one bit. Mostly because I'm too old to care about cosmetics. Like I've never really cared about what my character looked like in a game, but also I just don't like if it's not affecting the gameplay. Like Diablo Immortal is another story, but Diablo 4, like I'm totally fine with having a store on there that I never have to look at or pay attention to. If some people are into that, totally fine with me.
Yeah, I don't care. If you want to spend your hard-earned money on those digital goods, go for it. I've got some platinum saved up from battle passes, and when I see a set that's nice, I will treat myself. But until then, we're okay.
Nice.
You do you. You do you. Uh, you did bring up Diablo Immortal. It's kind of hard. It is. So this is a Diablo podcast. We talk a lot about Diablo. We talk a lot about Diablo 2 when a new season comes out. We'll talk about Diablo 3, and then obviously we talk a lot about Diablo 4. We don't talk about Diablo Immortal.
It's funny. Phone games are so difficult because having a phone, I don't know. I'm sure a lot of people feel this way. I don't know. A lot of people seem to play Diablo Immortal, so maybe not. But like the way I use my phone, my relationship with my phone is that it's a multitasking machine. Like when I'm on my phone, I'm constantly bouncing between like texts and Slack and Safari and like mail and whatever else, just like bouncing around all the time. And to have a game on there just like does not fit into that rotation because it feels like, especially a lot of games, a lot of modern games, when you minimize the app and go to something else, they'll like lose your progress or like they'll cut you out in some way that, or you could die or something like that. And for me to try to fit that into my phone use habits is just never going to happen. I know Immortal is on computers, but if you're going to play on computers, you might as well just play Diablo 4, right? So, it just will never fit in my life, and that's not even considering all of the like the fact that you essentially have to pay if you want the best chance at getting gear, which like really taints the experience of a Diablo game in the first place. So yeah, but the people I spoke to who worked on that game, people at Blizzard who were defending that game, a lot of people were like, look, like first of all, this is a game that like we had to. There were a lot of struggles between us and our partners in China over like finding the right balance of microtransactions and so on and so forth. But also, we made a game here that like we think is really really good, and you don't have to spend $1 on until the end game. So if you play it through, you don't have to spend $1 and you'll have a good time if you play through the whole campaign. Then to actually like do the best in the end game, yeah, you'll probably have to spend some money. But like up until then, we're super proud that we made this thing that you don't have to spend any money on. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like it'll never fit into my life, but I'm glad that that people are enjoying it.
Yeah, I've we know some people who've worked on it. Friend of the show, Leviathan, shout out. It is September 23rd for you. He, there's been some great work on the story, and I think you alluded to that. Um, then that end game barrier for money, that that to me is usually the roadblock. Love a good story, but also I'm an old and playing on my phone just doesn't work for me, much like you alluded to. So
Yeah, yeah.
it it just was never gonna it was never going to connect with me, even if without the shop, even without all the other parts, it wasn't gonna work for me. But I'm happy it's out there for those who enjoy it.
Sure.
That being said, we go another decade and we get Diablo 4 and another tumultuous experience leading up to it. In talking with people for the development of Diablo 4, were there any themes you kind of found resonating from the previous iterations of Diablo?
Yeah, Diablo games are a lot harder than you would think, considering how much is it of them are procedurally generated. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the same story. These games, the problem with these games is that like when you're developing them, there's only so much testing you can do. It is very, very difficult to really emulate the experience of a player who's going to be a hardcore end game player and to test the game at scale for those people. And so, what we keep seeing happen, and this happened with both Diablo 3 and Diablo 4, is that you have this polished, super fun campaign that like people seem to really love. And then when you get into end game, you have all sorts of problems, all sorts of balancing problems, all sorts of issues. And it's so funny. The last thing I wrote for this book. So the way books work is you typically have to finish them like 6 to 8 months before they actually hit store shelves. And so I finished most of my drafts in like by February, by March, it was pretty much done. But as I was going through final edits, the last thing I was able to add hit in May. And that was a little footnote in the Diablo 4 section that was all about how Diablo 4 followed a similar trajectory to Diablo 3, like except for the names, right? Diablo 3 was called God, what was it called?
Loot 2.0,
Loot 2.0, and then Diablo 4's version was called what? Loot
Loot
like
Reborn.
Blue Reborn, you got it, you know. Um, which is so funny. I mean, the parallels are just uncanny. And I think they both had similar problems of like the loop is broken. I think the only reason that Diablo 4 was never as controversial as Diablo 3 is that there was no auction house. And so there was no kind of sense of like this game is cheating me and trying to get me to spend money on it. But the problems are similar, and I think it's just because a game like this is just so difficult to really figure out until you have people playing it and really testing the end game at scale. That's just the nature of a Diablo game.
I think it is ironic that we are on the precipice of an expansion, and Diablo follows a very particular pattern. Diablo 2, when it released, was good but not great. Lord of Destruction comes out and it's amazing. Diablo 3 comes out, it's good, not great. Reaper of Souls comes out, it's amazing. Diablo 4 comes out, it's good, not great. And I guess the only pattern I can assume is that Vessel of Hatred will push it into that upper echelon.
Yeah, although for the first time we're gonna get more than one expansion this time, so that could change the
Well,
pattern.
there's still time for cancellations. We don't
That's true.
know. Like
You are right. You are 100%
it
correct.
is.
There is still
I,
time.
we brought it up a few podcasts ago. It's never happened. We've never had two expansions for a Diablo game. It would be very weird.
It will be weird, yeah. It'll be interesting to see. I think that like with Diablo 4, they have this opportunity, and I think they've said they plan to do this to really transform it into a service game that lasts for years to come before Diablo 5, and then maybe Diablo 5 comes out like after, as people are still playing Diablo 4, who knows? But there isn't the same kind of gap. And I think that is going to be much healthier for the game and for the people who like this game than starting from scratch again and running into the same problems again. So yeah, we'll see. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of good vibes around Vessel of Hatred. I'm certainly optimistic for it. And what your listeners should know is that Play Nice, my new book, is there's an audiobook version read by the one and only Ray Chase. Who is a fantastic voice actor and narrator. And the audiobook version comes out on the same day as the other versions of the book, which also happens to be the same day as Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred. So why not play the game while listening to the audiobook of the entire story of Blizzard? To me, that's just perfect serendipity.
That is an awesome little plug there. Or you could go out, you could get yourself a physical copy, and you could read in loading screens. You could read while it's downloading. You could read
True.
whenever, because let's face it, you're probably not going to be able to binge Diablo 4 all day. You're going to have to like go somewhere else, bring a book, and feel like you never really left. Jason, this has been a real treat, and thank you for giving up so much of your time here tonight because it's even later for you. You got kids. I know
Yeah,
how it
can you
is.
tell I'm like falling asleep as we talk? I'm just like so. I go to sleep at 10 o'clock every night because I usually wake up at like 6 or 6:30. So yeah, this is my bedtime. But no, thank you for having me, Xanth. I hope folks enjoy the book, and I hope Diablo 4 Vessel of Hatred is really really good. And I hope that that it's all good vibes.
Yeah, absolutely. And are you gonna talk about Diablo on your podcast? And where can we hear you talk and write and everything?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'm gonna play Vessel of Hatred because there's so many other games that I have to cover in the next few weeks. But you can of course hear me at Triple Click and find my rating at Bloomberg.com.
Well, thank you again, Jason. It has been a treat. Let's close it out as we always do with a moo. Moo.
Moo 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 moo.